The fire has already stopped. That is the detail no one talks about. We spend so much time discussing the destruction of Sodom, the brimstone, the screaming, the column of smoke rising into the sky like a wound in the atmosphere, that we never stop to ask what came next, what filled the silence after the last wall collapsed, what the survivors heard when the roaring ended and the world went completely unnaturally still, what Abraham saw on the ridge, what Lot felt on the road, what was left of a woman who had been running towards safety and stopped 3 miles short of it. The Bible records it. Every detail. It is all there, embedded in the text of Genesis 19, in the words of Jesus, in Luke 17, in the testimony of the prophets from Isaiah to Ezekiel to Amos, and in the geological evidence left behind in the Dead Sea Basin that scientists are only now beginning to fully understand. The 5 minutes after God destroyed Sodom are not missing from history. They are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to read the text slowly enough to see what it actually says. And what it says is more disturbing than the destruction itself. Because destruction, when it comes from God, is clean. It is fast, it is total, and in a strange way, it is simple. The destruction of Sodom took less time than it takes to read about it. The text moves quickly because the event moved quickly. Brimstone fell. Fire fell. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble in minutes. Simple, total, done. It is the aftermath that haunts. Because in the aftermath, the survivors have to figure out what kind of world they are now living in. They have to breathe the changed air and stand on the changed ground and look at each other with eyes that have just seen something that no human language was built to describe. They have to keep existing inside a reality that has been permanently altered. They have to decide in the next 5 minutes who they are going to be in a world that no longer contains Sodom. And the decisions they make in those 5 minutes, one of them will be sealed in salt forever. This is what happened. It is the 19th chapter of Genesis. The sun has just cleared the horizon over the Jordan Valley. Verse 23 tells us exactly that. The sun had risen over the earth when Lot came to Zoar. That detail is not decorative. The biblical writers were precise about time when precision mattered. The destruction of Sodom did not happen in darkness. It happened in full morning light. Whatever these survivors witnessed, they witnessed it clearly. Then, verse 24, "Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven." The Hebrew word used here for rained is the same word used for ordinary rainfall, matar. God did not hurl lightning bolts at Sodom. He did not send an earthquake. He rained on it. The most mundane of natural events, the kind of thing that farmers depend on and children dance in, was used to deliver absolute annihilation. The horror of Sodom is not only that it was destroyed, it is that the mechanism of its destruction was something as ordinary as weather. And then, verse 25, he overthrew those cities, and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. Every person, every structure, every tree, every planted field. The Hebrew word for overthrew is hafak, and it carries connotations that go beyond mere destruction. Hafak means to turn something completely upside down, to invert it, to make the inside become the outside. God did not simply flatten Sodom, he turned it inside out. But that is the overview. That is the 30,000-foot view of the event. We need to go closer. We need to enter the first 5 minutes. And to do that, we begin not in Sodom. We begin 3 miles up a mountain on a ridge overlooking the valley, where a very old man stands in the early morning air and watches the horizon begin to glow. Abraham is awake early. Genesis 19:27 tells us he went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. This was not coincidence. This was a man who knew something catastrophic was coming. He had spent the previous evening arguing with God about it, negotiating the fate of cities, and now, at first light, he returns to that same ridge. He is not there by accident. He is watching. What Abraham sees, according to verse 28, is this. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and he looked and saw the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. The Hebrew word used for furnace here is kivsham, the same word used in Exodus for the smelting furnaces of Egypt. Industrial heat, the kind of heat that transforms solid matter into something else entirely. Abraham is not watching smoke rise from burning buildings. He's watching the thermal signature of a region that has been converted, transformed at the molecular level into something unrecognizable. Pause on that image for a moment. A man standing on a mountain ridge at sunrise, looking down at a valley that is emitting the thermal signature of an industrial foundry. The Jordan Disk, that fertile, well-watered plain that Lot had chosen when he separated from Abraham years earlier, the land described in Genesis 13:10 as being like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, has been converted. The garden is gone. The irrigation channels are gone. The cultivated fields that made this the most productive agricultural region in the ancient Near East are gone. The cities that had developed over centuries, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and the small town of Zoar spared at the last moment, all of them gone, except Zoar, which Abraham cannot distinguish in the smoke. From the ridge, everything below the smoke line is invisible. Abraham knows what he is looking at. He had spent the previous evening in a conversation with God that would not be replicated in the Bible until Moses and the prophets. He had stood before the Lord. The text says, he stood before the Lord, a phrase used for formal petition, for legal intercession, and he had argued, not recklessly, not arrogantly, but with a persistent and almost audacious love for a city that had not earned it. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? He had asked, and the negotiation had descended incrementally, painfully, from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10. And God had said each time, if I find 10 righteous people, I will spare the city. There were not 10. There were not. Abraham knows this now, standing on the ridge. The smoke tells him everything his argument couldn't prevent, and yet he came back. He came back to the same spot where he had prayed, because people of faith do not abandon their watchpoints simply because the answer was not what they hoped. They return, they stand in the same place, they look at the same sky and breathe the same air and refuse to pretend that what happened didn't happen. They stay and they watch until they understand. Abraham will not understand today. Not yet. This is the first minute. Abraham on the ridge, watching a furnace that used to be a city, and 3 miles away, on the road descending toward the small town of Zoar, 2 people are running, and they are running without looking back, and one of them is about to make a decision that will define her in history forever. Lot and his family had been pulled out of Sodom by angelic force in the pre-dawn hours. Genesis 19:16 describes the moment with clinical precision. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. The word translated lingered is the Hebrew mahah. It implies hesitation, delay, the paralysis of someone who cannot quite make themselves leave, even knowing what was coming, even hearing it from angels. Lot lingered. The angels had given one instruction, recorded in verse 17. Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills lest you be swept away. Do not look back. The instruction seems simple. It sounds like practical advice. Don't slow down, don't turn around, just run. But in the ancient Near Eastern world, the act of looking back at a destroyed city carried a weight we do not immediately feel in our modern reading. To look back at a city in the moment of its divine judgment was to align yourself with it. To say, in the language of the body, that you belonged to what was being destroyed. The angels were not merely giving a safety tip. They were issuing a covenant command. Your body must say, without ambiguity, that you are leaving, not watching. Lot ran. His daughters ran. His wife, she looked back. The Hebrew text of Genesis 19:26 contains one of the most spare, most devastating sentences in all of Scripture. 4 words in Hebrew, and his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. No explanation, no dramatic scene, no recorded scream, no description of what she saw in the moment before the transformation, just the action and the consequence. The biblical writer gives us exactly what a trauma witness gives you when you ask them to describe the moment of the worst thing they ever saw. Stripped language, reduced to its minimum, because some events collapse the architecture of description. She became a pillar of salt. The Hebrew word for salt is melah, and in the ancient world, salt was not merely a seasoning. Salt was a covenant element. Salt was used in temple sacrifices. Salt preserved things from decay. Salt was the symbol of permanence and fidelity. The thing that could not rot, that outlasted everything organic, that resisted the normal entropy of the physical world. When God made a covenant that would never be broken, it was described as a covenant of salt. Numbers 18:19 and 2 Chronicles 13:5 both use this formula. A covenant of salt forever before the Lord. Salt meant permanence. Salt meant this will not change. And now, in an act of judgment that is also terribly an act of divine consistency, a woman who could not separate herself from the condemned city is preserved in the substance of permanence itself. She is not dead in the ordinary sense. She is not buried, not burned, not consumed by the fire that took everyone else she knew. She is fixed, frozen at the exact moment of her last choice. Preserved in salt at the precise second she decided, with her body, that she still belonged to what God was destroying. The salt does not punish her. The salt simply tells the truth about her. It makes her last choice permanent. And this is where the psychological terror of the story reaches its peak, not in the destruction of Sodom, which happened to people who were absent from this text, who the narrative never personalizes, but in the transformation of this woman who was present, who was fleeing, who was almost free. The destruction of Sodom happens off-screen. We see the smoke. We are told cities were overthrown, but we are given no survivors from inside the city to grieve over, no names, no final words. The Bible deliberately prevents us from knowing the people who died in Sodom. It gives us instead a woman on a road, with a name we are never told, with reasons we are never given. 3 miles from safety, and the only named consequence of the entire destruction is hers, because her story is our story, not the story of people consumed by fire in a condemned city. The story of someone who was pulled out, who was on the road, who had every reason to keep moving, and who could not fully let go. This is the second minute. And now we have to sit with what this means for the people who did not look back. Lot and his daughters are running. The road is descending towards Zor. The air behind them is changing. The temperature spike from the burning sulfur would have been detectable even miles away, a wall of heat pressing against their backs like a physical force. The smell of sulfur, the biblical brimstone, is in the chemistry world sulfur dioxide, and at high concentrations, it is not merely unpleasant. At concentrations produced by a massive sulfuric event, it causes the eyes to water uncontrollably, the throat to contract as the body tries to protect the airways, the lungs to begin a slow and panicking rejection of every breath. The survivors of Sodom's destruction were not running through clean morning air. They were running through the leading edge of a chemical event, their lungs burning, their eyes streaming, the taste of it on every tooth. And at some point on that road, in the 2nd or 3rd minute after the destruction reached its peak, Lot stopped. He heard something, or felt something, or simply realized that the footsteps behind him had changed. 3 sets of footsteps had become 2. He did not look back. The text does not tell us he looked back, but he must have known. A man does not arrive in Zoar and fail to notice that his wife is not beside him. A man does not run a 3-mile road in the company of his family and arrive at the end of it without realizing that one of his family did not arrive with him. The silence in the text at this point is the silence of trauma. The Bible does not record what Lot said or did when he understood that his wife was gone. It does not record the moment his daughters understood it either. It simply moves forward, to Zoar, to the cave, to what comes next. Because that is what survivors do. They move forward because stopping is not an option, because the air still smells wrong, and the road behind them is still dangerous, and the only direction available is forward, even when forward means carrying something that cannot be carried without breaking. Genesis 19:30 will tell us, several verses later, that after arriving in Zoar, he was afraid to live in Zoar. The fear is not explained in the text. It does not need to be. Every element of what Lot had just experienced was converging into a single, overwhelming psychological reality. The world he had known was gone, the people he had known were gone, the home he had built was gone, and the woman who had stood beside him through all of it was 3 miles behind him in a form that no longer had a heartbeat. Lot and his daughters were alive. They were alive, and they were completely, catastrophically alone in a world that had been burned clean of everything familiar. This is survivor's psychology. This is what happens to the human mind when it has been present at catastrophe at this scale. You run, you survive, you stop running, and then you realize that the world you are standing in is not the world that existed an hour ago. The road is the same road. The hills are the same hills. The sky is the same sky, except that the direction of the smoke has changed, and there is an absence in the air where familiar sounds used to live. But the world is wrong. The world is permanently, irreversibly wrong. And the fear that grips Lot in Zoar is not cowardice. It is the completely rational response of a mind that has just absorbed information that its categories cannot contain. God had destroyed 5 cities in one morning. The city he was now standing in, Zoar, was alive only because of him. The angels had said so explicitly, "I can do nothing till you arrive there." Lot knew that his presence in Zoar was the only variable that distinguished it from the smoking rubble on the horizon. And Lot also knew that he was not righteous enough to be confident about what that meant for tomorrow. He would not stay in Zoar. He would go to the hills after all, the hills the angels had originally told him to go to, the hills he had argued against because he was afraid of them. In the end, the place he feared proved to be the only place he could survive psychologically. Not because the hills were safer, but because the hills had no echoes, no familiar streets, no people who remembered the cities that were gone. In the hills, in the silence of a cave above the Dead Sea, Lot could begin the impossible work of reassembling an identity in the ruins of everything that identity had been built on. This is the 3rd minute, Lot making the only decision available to him: keep moving up, not back. In the 4th minute, while Lot is beginning the ascent toward the hills and Abraham is still fixed on the ridge, the geography itself is still changing. The fire does not end like a turned switch. A city that has been struck by catastrophic heat does not go cold in a minute. The rubble burns, the wood burns. The stored grain, the woven textiles, the oil jars, the wooden beams of roofs and doorframes, all of it continues to burn, feeding the column of smoke that Abraham watches grow from the ridge above. What began as the noise of fire and destruction settles, by the 4th minute, into the quieter, more sustained sound of aftermath. The creak of hot stone contracting, the hiss of burning material, the sound of walls that were damaged in the first moment, continuing their slow collapse as the heat weakens what survived the initial impact. The silence that follows a catastrophe is never truly silent. It is the wrong sounds replacing the right ones. The city used to have a sound: voices, commerce, animals, water moving in channels, gates opening and closing. Those sounds are gone. In their place, fire settling into rubble, smoke, and somewhere above it all the sound of wind moving through a valley that no longer has walls to redirect it. The daughters of Lot heard this, running behind their father, then walking, then arriving at Zoar and sitting somewhere within its walls and listening to a city that was not burning continue to make the ordinary sounds of life. A sound that must have been almost unbearable in its normalcy. The neighbors of Zoar going about their morning, unaware or only dimly aware of what had just happened to the cities on the far side of the ridge. The smell in the air telling the story, but the sounds of Zoar telling a different one. And in the gap between those two realities, two daughters sitting with a grief that had no language yet. We do not know their names. The text never gives them. They are identified only by their relationship to their father, and later by the nations that will come from them. But they were people. They were young women who had grown up in a city, who had friends in that city, who had sisters there, two older sisters married to men of Sodom, who had laughed when their father warned them. Those sisters did not escape. Those sisters are in the smoke. The unnamed daughters of Lot in the fourth minute are sitting in Zoar with the knowledge that everyone they grew up with is gone. This is what the fifth minute inherits, this grief, this disorientation, this world that has been remade in a single morning without anyone's consent. Before we go to Abraham in the fifth minute, and the fifth minute belongs to Abraham, and it carries the theological center of everything this story is trying to tell, we need to stop and examine what modern science has confirmed about what physically happened in those first minutes. Because the Bible's account is not only theological testimony, it is, increasingly, a document that science is beginning to corroborate in ways that are difficult to dismiss. If you believe what the Bible says about Sodom, and we are going to show you that there are very good reasons to take this text seriously as historical testimony, then the physical evidence of those first minutes should be visible in the landscape of the Dead Sea region to this day. And it is. If this is the first time you're watching this channel, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We cover the biblical record with the depth it deserves, the history, the archaeology, the human psychology behind the most important events ever recorded. New videos every week. In 2021, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Nature Scientific Reports, examining a site in Jordan called Tall El-Hammam. This is a location that has been identified by a number of archaeologists, most notably Dr. Stephen Collins of Trinity Southwest University, as a strong candidate for the city of Sodom. The evidence for this identification includes its geographic position in the Jordan Disk, the well-watered plain described in Genesis 13 that Lot chose when he separated from Abraham. Its size, it was the largest Bronze Age city in the region. And its dating, which corresponds to the period in which the biblical account places the destruction. What the 2021 study found at Tall El-Hammam was this: a layer of destruction approximately 3,600 years old that contains something the researchers describe as extreme high-temperature anomalies. They found pottery shards with outer surfaces that had been melted and then re-solidified at temperatures in excess of 1,500 degrees Celsius. They found zircon crystals, which can only form above 1,120 degrees Celsius, embedded in clay. They found trinitite-like glass, a substance previously associated only with nuclear detonations and meteorite impacts. They found spherules of platinum, iron, and iridium at concentrations consistent with a cosmic airburst event. They also found, specifically and explicitly, high concentrations of sulfur in the destruction layer. What the researchers concluded, and this is published peer-reviewed science, is that Tall El-Hammam was likely destroyed by a cosmic airburst event approximately 3,600 years ago. an asteroid or comet fragment that exploded in the atmosphere above the city, generating temperatures and pressures that no human construction could have survived. The event would have leveled everything within a radius of several kilometers. It would have ignited every flammable material simultaneously, and the airburst, detonating above the Dead Sea Basin, which has the highest concentration of natural salt on the surface of the planet, would have lofted millions of tons of salt and sulfur-laden sediment into the air and rained it down on the surrounding landscape. It rained fire and salt from heaven. The Bible said it first. Now, we want to be careful here. This is not proof that Tall El-Hammam is Sodom. The identification remains debated among scholars. This is not proof that the cosmic airburst event was the mechanism God used to destroy the city, though it is not theologically impossible that God used a natural mechanism as his instrument of judgment. He often does. What it is extraordinary evidence that something happened in this specific region at a time consistent with the biblical dating that matches the biblical description of fire and brimstone from heaven with remarkable precision. The salt that preserved Lot's wife, the salt of her memorial, was physically present in the air that morning. The scientists found it in the data. The salt that preserved Lot's wife, the salt of her memorial, was physically present in the air that morning. The scientists found it in the data. This is the 5th minute, and the 5th minute belongs to Abraham. While the fire settles, and Lot sits in Zoar, and the daughters carry their grief, and the smoke continues to rise from the valley, Abraham is still on the ridge. He has not moved. He is watching the smoke in the way that a person watches something they prayed against, something they argued against, something they hoped against, until the last possible moment, and lost. But Abraham is not only watching the smoke, he is understanding something. The understanding will not be complete today. The full meaning of what has just happened will take centuries to unfold, through prophets who use Sodom as a reference point, through the historical memory of Israel that keeps returning to this valley as an example of what divine judgment looks like, through Jesus himself, who will stand 2,000 years later and point at Sodom's destruction as the pattern for the end of the age. The understanding is a process, not a moment. But the process has to start somewhere, and it starts on this ridge in the 5th minute when Abraham looks at the smoke and does not turn away. The text of Genesis 19:29 contains the most important sentence in the entire account. So it was that, when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. God remembered Abraham. This sentence is not in the chapter because the biblical writer wanted to make Abraham feel good about the night's events. It is there because it is doing something structurally and theologically crucial to the entire narrative. The rescue of Lot is not a story about Lot's merit. It is not a story about Lot's righteousness or his wisdom or his choices. In this chapter, Lot has been wrong about nearly everything. He lingered when he should have fled. He chose Zoar when he should have gone to the hills. He lost his wife on the road to a failure of commitment. Lot is not the hero of his own rescue story. He is the beneficiary of someone else's. The rescue of Lot is a story about the efficacy of intercession. Abraham prayed, Abraham argued, Abraham persisted through 6 rounds of negotiation with the creator of the universe and never gave up and never apologized for asking. And when the city fell anyway because the minimum requirement of righteousness was not met, the intercession did not disappear. It could not disappear. A prayer prayed in faith before a holy God does not simply evaporate when the circumstance changes. It attaches to what it can reach. It finds the person it can save. It found Lot. 3 miles from Sodom, on a road above the Dead Sea, A man whose own choices had put him in the worst possible position was pulled out by angelic hands, not because of who he was, but because of who loved him, because of who had stood on a ridge the night before and argued for him, because of a covenant that connected Lot to Abraham and Abraham to God. And therefore, through that chain of covenant, Lot to God, even when Lot could not get there himself. Abraham is standing on that same ridge in the 5th minute, watching smoke instead of negotiating mercy. And what he is beginning to understand, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that faith understands things before explanation arrives, is that the prayer worked, not the way he hoped. The city was not spared. The 10 righteous people were not found. The negotiation did not prevent the destruction, but the prayer worked where it could reach. Lot is alive. Somewhere in that smoke, Lot is alive because Abraham asked. This is the theology of intercession that runs from Genesis 19 through the entire Bible to the book of Hebrews, which says of Jesus, he always lives to make intercession for them. The prayer of the righteous before God is not wasted even when the answer is not what was hoped for. It finds what it can save. It covers what it can reach. And the one who receives the benefit may not know in the first 5 minutes that they are alive because of someone else's faithfulness. Lot does not know this yet, sitting in Zoar. He does not know that his survival has a name behind it, that the mercy extended to him on the road was not generic divine compassion, but the specific, targeted answer to a specific, targeted prayer prayed by a man who loved him enough to argue with God about him. He will figure it out eventually, or maybe he won't. The Bible doesn't tell us whether Lot ever learned the full story of his rescue. Maybe he spent the rest of his life in the cave above the Dead Sea, thinking he survived by luck, by coincidence, by the arbitrary grace of angels who happened to choose his house to visit. Maybe he never knew that his uncle had stood on a ridge in the dark and argued for his life. But God remembered. And in the economy of covenant, that is enough. Genesis 19:30 tells us that Lot and his daughters eventually left Zoar and lived in a cave. This is not a metaphor. The man who had been among the wealthiest in Sodom, who had a house with a door, who hosted guests, who had standing in the community, this man and his daughters retreated to a cave in the mountains above the Dead Sea and lived in it. The descent from city life to cave dwelling is recorded in one verse, and its psychological weight is enormous. It is the final accounting of what 5 minutes of judgment costs the people who survive it. The first 5 minutes after God destroys something are always the minutes of incomprehension. This is not an accident. It is a design. The prophets will confirm it later. Isaiah 13 will describe the aftermath of divine judgment as a landscape of permanent desolation. Jeremiah 49 and 50 will use Sodom as the baseline of what total destruction looks like. Amos 4:11 will record God himself saying to Israel, I overthrew some of you, as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, and you were as a brand plucked out of the burning. The aftermath of Sodom becomes, in the prophetic literature, the reference point, the standard, the thing against which all other destruction is measured, and Jesus will use it too. Luke 17:28-32 contains one of the most chilling passages in the New Testament. Jesus is describing the nature of the kingdom of God's arrival, how sudden, how unexpected, how total. And he says, likewise, just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. And then, in verse 32, 3 words that have puzzled and disturbed readers for 2,000 years. Remember Lot's wife, not remember Sodom, not remember the judgment, not remember to flee. Remember Lot's wife. The woman who looked back. The woman who, in the first 5 minutes after the destruction, could not complete the act of leaving. Who turned, and in turning, said with her body what her feet were trying to deny, who was preserved in salt at the moment of her greatest failure, frozen in a posture of looking backward at what God had already judged. Why does Jesus point to her specifically? Because the danger he is warning against is not located in the people left behind in the metaphorical Sodom. It is located in the ones who are fleeing, the ones who have already been pulled out, who know the truth, who have seen the angels, who are on the road, but who cannot make the final commitment, who keep one eye on what they're supposed to be leaving. Consider how extraordinary this is. Jesus is speaking to his disciples about the end of the age. He is describing what the arrival of the kingdom of God will look like. Sudden, total, like lightning, like a flood, like fire from heaven on a valley that was alive the moment before and ash the moment after. He wants them to understand the urgency. He wants them to understand that when that moment comes, there will be no time for hesitation, no space for negotiating a smaller Zoar, no opportunity to run back into the house for the things you left behind. Luke 17:31 says it explicitly. On that day, let the one who is on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away, and likewise let the one who is in the field not turn back. Do not go back for your things. Do not turn back. And then, as if the point has not quite landed yet, as if he can see in their eyes that they are still processing the instruction theoretically from a safe intellectual distance. Remember Lot's wife. 3 words. A whole human life. A whole theology of failure compressed into 3 words. Remember her not as a monster. Remember her not as someone who deserved what she got in a way that you could never deserve it. Remember her as someone who was running, who was almost there, who had been dragged out of the city by mercy she did not earn and placed on a road towards survival she had not arranged, who had everything she needed to make it, except the ability to completely surrender what she was leaving behind. Remember her as someone who might have been you. The Church Fathers spent considerable energy debating what exactly Lot's wife's sin was. Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century, argued that she looked back with longing, that her heart had never left Sodom, even when her body was forced out of it. Origen suggested she looked back out of compassion, out of grief for the people being destroyed, a grief that was not wrong in itself, but that became deadly because it caused her to disobey a direct command of God. Jerome said the pillar of salt was a symbol. Salt corrupts, and her corruption had been lurking beneath the surface all along, revealed only in the moment of ultimate test. But perhaps the most disturbing interpretation is the simplest one. She looked back because looking back is what human beings do, because the human mind, under extreme stress, does not automatically orient toward the future. It orients toward the familiar, toward what is known, toward the patterns and places and people that have organized its experience until this moment. Looking back is not always a moral failure. Sometimes it is simply the baseline response of a creature whose entire nervous system is wired to hold on. The tragedy is not that she was weak. The tragedy is that her ordinary, human, neurologically normal instinct to look back toward the familiar happened at a moment when the cost of that instinct was absolute. And Jesus says, remember her. Know that this is possible. Know that it can happen to someone who is running in the right direction. Know that proximity to salvation is not the same as arrival at it. Know that the final 5 minutes, the final stretch of the road, the last miles before Zoar, those minutes require something more than momentum. They require a settled commitment, a decision made not just with the feet, but with the eyes, a deliberate conscious choice about what you will and will not look at anymore. There is a CTA hidden in Remember Lot's Wife that is more powerful than anything a modern content strategist could engineer. Jesus is not saying, remember that judgment is coming. He is saying, remember that salvation requires the whole self. Remember that you can be out of Egypt and still die in the wilderness. Remember that you can be out of Sodom and still become a monument to the thing you couldn't leave behind. Remember that the distance between you and the life you are running toward is crossed not by speed, but by direction. And direction is determined not by your feet, but by your face. In the first minutes after God moves in judgment, the most dangerous place is not inside the city. It is on the road out, looking back. This is the psychological horror that the story is really telling. Not the fire, not the brimstone, not the smoke rising like the smoke of a furnace. The horror is the woman on the road who was supposed to live, who had done everything right up to the last moment, who was 3 miles from safety, and who, in the 5 minutes that determined everything, could not bring herself to commit. The Hebrew does not tell us she turned around. The verb translated looked back is nabat, and it can mean to look sideways, to glance, not necessarily to turn completely. Some rabbinical commentators have suggested she looked back with longing. Others say it was curiosity. Others say it was grief. She was looking back for the daughters she had left behind, the 2 daughters already married to men of Sodom who had laughed at Lot's warning and refused to flee. Whatever the internal reason, the external act was the same. A choice made in the body in the most critical 5 minutes of her life. And the Bible records it without judgment, without explanation, without editorial comment, just the choice and the consequence. Because that is how the Bible tells us the truth about judgment, not with lectures, with stories, not with explanations of what you should feel, with images that you cannot stop seeing once they have entered your mind. A pillar of salt on a road above the Dead Sea, an old man on a ridge watching smoke rise from where 4 cities used to be, 2 girls running down a mountain into a future they cannot yet imagine. This is what the first 5 minutes looked like. And here is the question that the story leaves you with, not as a theological exercise, not as a history lesson, but as the most personal and pressing question you will face this week. What are you looking back at? Not the question of whether God's judgment was just, not the question of what Sodom's specific sins were, though the text is explicit about them. Genesis 19, Ezekiel 16:49-50, Jude 1:7. Not the question of whether Tall El-Hammam is the right site, or what mechanism God used to bring the fire from heaven. The question is simpler, more uncomfortable. Jesus looked at the entire story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the fire, the angels, the survival, the transformation of the landscape. And the one thing he chose to highlight, the one detail he carried forward into his own teaching about the end of the age, was a woman on a road who looked back. She was not in the city. She was out. She was not condemned. She was rescued. She was not distant from salvation. She was 3 miles from it. And she looked back. Every person watching this has something behind them that the mercy of God has pulled them out of, or is in the process of pulling them out of. Every person watching this has a road they are supposed to be running down toward something, away from something else. And every person watching this knows, with a certainty that does not require theological training to feel, what their version of looking back looks like. The first 5 minutes after God moves in judgment are decisive, not because God is watching to see if you will make a mistake, but because what you do in those first 5 minutes reveals what you actually believe, whether your feet and your heart are moving in the same direction, whether you have truly left or only physically departed. Lot's wife was physically departed. She had left the city. She had left the house. She had followed the angels out through the gate and down the road in the pre-dawn hours. She had done everything externally required. And in the moment of decision, the moment when everything that was about to be lost was still visible behind her, she discovered that she had never actually left. The salt that preserved her was already in the air. The chemistry of judgment was already in motion. The first minute, the second minute, the third, they were accumulating, and she was still running, and she might have made it. She was almost there. And then she looked back, and the Bible says she became a pillar of salt. Not that she was turned into one from the outside. The Hebrew verb haya, became, carries the sense of a transformation that was already inherent in what she was. She did not become something foreign to herself. She became, in the most literal sense, exactly what her turning had made her. The outer form finally matched the inner reality. This is what the 5 minutes after Sodom reveal. Not the fire, not the physics, not the archaeology. The revelation of the first 5 minutes is this. In the moment when everything is at stake and there is no more time for ambiguity, what you truly love becomes visible. Your body says it. Your eyes say it. The direction your face points says it. And in the economy of divine judgment and divine mercy, that revelation is not the beginning of something new. It is the confirmation of something that has been true all along. Abraham is still on the ridge when the smoke finally begins to thin. It will take hours for it to clear completely. The valley below him is unrecognizable. 5 cities, thousands of people, every structure and tree and planted field, Hafach, turned inside out, transformed at the level of matter itself. And the man who had argued for the city, who had negotiated with God, with a boldness that still shocks readers. Abraham looks at the smoke and he knows that the negotiation had limits, that mercy had conditions, that righteousness was required and none was found. But he also knows, because he will learn it later, in the way that faith always learns things later, after the fire and the silence and the long walk home, that his prayers were not wasted, that Lot is alive somewhere in that smoke, that the covenant carries forward even when the city does not, that the first 5 minutes of judgment are not the end of the story for those who are connected to the one who intercedes. The valley of Sodom is a desert now. The Dead Sea fills much of the basin. The water is so saturated with salt that nothing lives in it, not fish, not plants, not the smallest organism capable of survival in ordinary water. The ancient city, whatever it was, wherever it stood, lies somewhere under or near that water, or under the ash layers that archaeology is only beginning to uncover. Travelers who visit the region today report that the air near the Dead Sea still carries, on certain days, a faint sulfurous quality that has no obvious modern source. Scientists attribute it to the geology of the Rift Valley. The Bible reader might think of something else. The land still smells like morning, the morning that ended 4 cities. And somewhere, according to the ancient tradition maintained by Jewish and Christian sources from the 1st century onward, somewhere on the road above the Dead Sea, a pillar of salt still stands where a woman once stood. Some ancient writers claim to have seen it. The early church father Clement of Rome, writing in the 1st century, says simply, Lot's wife, who went out with him being of a different mind and not continuing in agreement with him, was made an example of, so as to be a pillar of salt unto this day. Unto this day. The monument to the woman who looked back is still there, not necessarily as a literal pillar of salt. Salt dissolves, and the specific formation may long since have been erased by weather. But the monument exists in every person who has heard this story and felt the sudden guilty recognition of what it means to run from something you have not fully surrendered. Every person who has escaped a city and then stood on the road with safety visible ahead and destruction visible behind and felt their head begin to turn. The story does not condemn her, it only records her. And Jesus, standing 2,000 years after her death, chose her as his warning. If this video opened something in you, a question, a recognition, a memory, share it with someone you love. The Bible's account of Sodom is not a story about ancient people who deserved what they got. It is a story about the human heart in the moment of ultimate choice, and that moment is not as far away as we imagine. The destruction of Sodom happened in minutes. The choice of Lot's wife happened in seconds. The mercy that pulled Lot out of the city, the covenant mercy of Abraham's intercession, took one conversation the evening before. None of it required years. It required, in the end, only the willingness to keep moving, to run toward what was ahead without turning toward what was behind, to let the angels pull you forward even when every instinct in you wants to stop and look back, to arrive in Zoar, in the small, imperfect, barely spared place of safety, rather than be preserved in the posture of what you couldn't give up. The fire behind you is real. The road ahead is real. And the 5 minutes you have right now, the 5 minutes of this moment, this day, this season of your life, they are more decisive than they look. Lot's wife had 5 minutes on a road. She didn't make it. But you are still running. Keep running. The sun has risen over the earth. The smoke is still climbing. Abraham is on the ridge watching, and somewhere behind you on the road, the salt of the covenant is still in the air. And somewhere ahead of you, the door of Zoar is still open. Don't look back. For a deeper look at the moments in Scripture that changed everything, the events that most people have never examined at this level of detail, the video waiting for you next will take you somewhere you've never been in the biblical record. Don't miss it.